Some objects don't belong to the living twice. And when they do, they carry a truth no one is prepared to face. Claire Whitmore had spent 8 years convincing the world she had moved on. The financial magazines called her the Iron Queen of Wall Street, the billionaire CEO who rebuilt a struggling technology empire into one of the most influential companies in America before turning 42. Investors admired her discipline. Employees respected her calm authority. Television hosts praised her resilience whenever they mentioned the tragic accident that had claimed her husband's life nearly a decade earlier. They always said she survived unimaginable loss. What they never understood was that survival and healing were never the same thing. Every morning before sunrise, Claire still opened the small walnut box inside her Manhattan penthouse and looked at the empty velvet cushion where a silver chain had once rested. It had disappeared with her husband, Daniel. On the rainy October night, authorities declared him dead after his car plunged into a river outside Seattle. The police recovered the vehicle. They recovered fragments of clothing. They recovered enough evidence to close the case. But they never recovered Daniel's favorite chain, a simple sterling silver necklace carrying a handcrafted pendant engraved with the date of their wedding in tiny Roman numerals. Claire had commissioned it from a local jeweler during the first year of their marriage. There had never been another one like it. She knew every scratch, every curve, every imperfection because she had watched the craftsman shape it with his own hands. Which was why, standing beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Pacific Horizon Foundation Gala in downtown Los Angeles, she forgot how to breathe. Hundreds of guests filled the historic ballroom dressed in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns, their conversations blending into soft jazz played by a live quartet near the grand staircase. Cameras flashed. Glasses clinked. Charity donors exchanged polished smiles beneath warm golden lights reflected across marble floors polished to a mirror finish. Claire had attended hundreds of events like this over the years. They rarely surprised her anymore. Tonight was different. Her attention drifted across the room until it landed on a man standing quietly near one of the towering windows overlooking the city skyline. He stood taller than nearly everyone around him, wearing an impeccably tailored black suit with the effortless confidence of someone who never needed to prove his importance. His expression remained composed while business leaders greeted him with cautious respect. Some whispered his name, Ethan Kong, a Korean businessman to some, an untouchable figure surrounded by rumors to others. Claire had read enough headlines to recognize him immediately, though no article ever seemed able to explain how he accumulated influence across industries spanning 3 continents. She had no reason to approach him, until the ballroom lights caught something resting beneath the collar of his white dress shirt. A silver chain. Her heartbeat stumbled. The pendant slipped into view for only a second as he turned toward another guest. Roman numerals. The exact engraving. The same delicate scratch near the lower edge where Daniel had accidentally dropped it during a weekend hiking trip in Colorado years before. Claire's fingers tightened around the crystal glass she had been holding all evening. The room blurred into distant echoes. Every carefully constructed wall inside her collapsed beneath the impossible sight before her eyes. That chain should have vanished forever with the man she had buried in her heart 8 years ago. Yet there it was, resting against the chest of a stranger whose calm gaze carried secrets as old as her grief. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, Claire realized the story she had accepted for nearly a decade might never have been the truth at all. Claire did not remember placing her champagne on the passing server's tray. She only realized her hands were empty when the soft music returned to her ears, replacing the rushing silence that had swallowed every other sound. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong continued speaking with several international investors as though nothing unusual had happened. His posture remained effortless, his expression unreadable, his attention calm enough to suggest he had never carried the weight of another person's memories around his neck. Claire forced herself to breathe slowly. She had spent years making decisions worth billions of dollars under relentless pressure. Panic had never been part of her vocabulary. Yet tonight, logic and emotion refused to exist in the same room. She quietly stepped away from the center of the gala and toward a quieter hallway lined with framed photographs celebrating the foundation's charitable work. The polished marble reflected the warm glow of antique wall sconces, while distant conversations faded behind heavy wooden doors. She closed her eyes for only a moment, but the memories arrived immediately. Daniel had laughed the day she gave him the necklace. He had insisted that expensive gifts were unnecessary, but he wore that chain every single day afterward. Whether he was wearing a tailored suit at a board meeting or a faded sweatshirt during weekend hikes, the silver pendant never left his neck. It became as familiar to Claire as the sound of his footsteps crossing the hardwood floors of their first apartment in Boston. Even after years together, she would still reach out absent-mindedly to straighten it whenever they stood beside one another. That tiny habit had survived longer than the marriage itself. 8 years earlier, the detective handling Daniel's case had gently explained that Rivers often kept secrets forever. Personal belongings disappeared. Jewelry drifted away. Certain questions simply remained unanswered. Claire had listened without arguing because grief exhausted every remaining ounce of strength she possessed. She signed the paperwork. She attended the memorial service. She accepted condolences from hundreds of strangers. Then she buried every unanswered question beneath endless work until success became the only language she allowed herself to speak. Her assistant, Melissa, appeared quietly at the end of the hallway with a concerned expression. "Claire, the auction begins in 5 minutes. They are expecting your remarks." Claire managed a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Please tell them I will be there shortly." Melissa hesitated. "Are you feeling all right? I just need a minute." As soon as Melissa disappeared, Claire opened the secure photo folder on her phone. Thousands of images filled the screen, but she knew exactly where to look. Within seconds, she found the picture taken during their 5th wedding anniversary at a vineyard in Northern California. Daniel stood beside her with the afternoon sun behind his shoulders, smiling as the silver pendant rested against his navy shirt. Claire enlarged the image until the engraving became visible. Her pulse quickened. The small scratch near the lower edge matched perfectly. It was impossible to mistake. No jeweler could accidentally reproduce years of tiny, wear in exactly the same place. She lowered the phone slowly and looked back through the ballroom entrance. Ethan had not moved very far. Several guests greeted him with careful respect, but he remained composed, almost detached, as though crowds had never impressed him. Then, for the briefest moment, he lifted his hand and touched the pendant with unconscious familiarity, the same absent gesture Daniel used to make whenever he was thinking deeply. Claire felt her heartbeat stop once again. It was not only the necklace. It was the habit, the memory, the quiet movement that no stranger should have shared. Whatever explanation existed, it reached far beyond coincidence, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Claire chose not to walk away from the questions that had haunted every silent morning of her life. Claire remained near the entrance of the ballroom for several long seconds, watching Ethan Kong through a sea of tailored suits and sparkling evening gowns. Every instinct told her to wait, to investigate quietly, to let professionals uncover whatever impossible explanation existed. That was how she had built one of the largest technology companies in America. She gathered evidence before making decisions. She trusted facts over emotion. But facts had already failed her once, 8 years earlier, and tonight emotion refused to be ignored. Before doubt could regain control, she crossed the polished marble floor with calm, deliberate steps. Guests greeted her as she passed, offering congratulations on her latest acquisition and invitations to future charity events. She acknowledged each smile with effortless grace while never taking her eyes off the man standing beside the panoramic windows overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Ethan noticed her approach before she spoke. His dark eyes lifted from the conversation he had been having with an ambassador from Seoul, and for the briefest instant his expression revealed something unexpected. It was not surprise. It was recognition, as though he had anticipated this meeting long before she decided to walk across the room. The ambassador excused himself politely, leaving them alone beneath the warm reflections of crystal chandeliers. Neither of them spoke immediately. Around them, the orchestra continued its gentle melody while servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared desserts. The elegant celebration continued without realizing that two strangers had just stepped into a moment capable of rewriting nearly a decade of one woman's life. Claire offered a composed smile that concealed the storm beneath it. "Mr. Kong, I am Claire Whitmore." Ethan inclined his head with quiet respect. "I know who you are, Ms. Whitmore. Congratulations on your foundation's newest education initiative. I have heard remarkable things about your work. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who rarely wasted words. Claire appreciated the courtesy, but she could not allow the conversation to drift elsewhere. Her eyes lowered to the silver chain resting against his shirt. May I ask you something personal? Ethan followed her gaze without moving. His fingers instinctively brushed the pendant before falling back to his side. A nearly invisible change crossed his expression, subtle enough that few people would have noticed. Claire did. Where did you get that necklace? She asked softly. The sounds of the ballroom seemed to disappear again. Ethan remained silent for several heartbeats. His eyes studied her face carefully, almost as though he were searching for confirmation of something he had carried within himself for years. When he finally answered, his voice had become quieter than before. It was given to me a long time ago. Claire felt hope and fear collide inside her chest. By whom? Ethan looked toward the city lights beyond the glass before returning his attention to her. By a man who asked me to protect it until the right moment arrived. Claire struggled to keep her breathing steady. What was his name? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Have you ever reached a point where the truth becomes more dangerous than the lie that protected everyone? Claire stared at him, unable to understand why a stranger would respond with another mystery. I only asked about a necklace. Ethan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No, Ms. Whitmore. You asked about someone you have never stopped searching for. Before Claire could speak again, a member of the gala committee approached to announce that the keynote presentations were about to begin. Ethan offered a respectful nod and stepped away with measured composure, disappearing into the gathering crowd, while leaving behind a single sentence that echoed louder than the orchestra filling the grand ballroom. When this evening ends, he said without looking back, I believe it is finally time for someone to keep a promise that has waited far too many years. Claire delivered her keynote address exactly as planned, speaking with the same measured confidence that had earned the trust of shareholders, entrepreneurs, and world leaders for nearly 2 decades. She spoke about innovation, opportunity, and the responsibility that came with extraordinary success. The audience applauded warmly. Cameras flashed. Reporters gathered near the stage, hoping for a brief interview before the evening concluded. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Only Claire knew she could not remember a single sentence she had spoken. Every thought returned to the silver chain and the quiet certainty in Ethan Kang's voice. He had not sounded like a man inventing a story. He had spoken as though he had been carrying someone else's promise for years. Nearly an hour later, the ballroom gradually emptied as guests moved toward private receptions throughout the hotel. Claire declined every invitation, politely excusing herself before stepping into the quiet executive lounge reserved for keynote speakers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing skyline, while the distant sounds of the gala faded into a gentle murmur. She poured herself a glass of water, hoping the silence would help organize the questions racing through her mind. Instead, another memory surfaced. Daniel had always believed promises were sacred, even the small ones. If he told someone he would arrive at 6 o'clock, he appeared 5 minutes early. If he promised to help a neighbor move furniture on a Saturday morning, he never canceled. Once, during their first Christmas together, he drove nearly 400 miles through a snowstorm simply because he had promised his elderly aunt he would decorate her house before the holidays. Claire used to tease him for treating every commitment as though the world depended on it. Daniel always smiled and answered the same way. People remember whether you keep your word long after they forget what you actually said. That sentence echoed through her thoughts as someone knocked gently on the lounge door. It was Ethan. He entered alone, without assistance or security, carrying himself with the same composed confidence she had noticed earlier. He closed the door quietly behind him, allowing the room to settle into complete stillness. Neither of them rushed to speak. Ethan looked toward the city lights before removing the silver chain from around his neck with careful hands. He held it respectfully for a moment rather than immediately offering it to her. I wondered how long it would take before I finally met you, he said softly. Claire stared at the pendant resting in his palm. Up close, every detail became unmistakable. The tiny scratch, the handcrafted edges, the worn clasp Daniel had repaired himself one summer afternoon. Tears threatened to blur her vision. but she refused to let them fall before she understood the truth. "How did you know my name?" she asked. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. "Because your husband spoke about you as though you were the strongest person he had ever known." The words struck her harder than she expected. She searched Ethan's face for any sign of deception, but found only quiet sincerity. "You knew Daniel." Ethan nodded once. "Only for a single night. Yet that night changed the course of both our lives." Claire took one cautious step closer. "Then tell me what really happened." Ethan lowered his gaze briefly before answering. "I will tell you everything. But before I do, there is one thing you deserve to know first." He extended the necklace toward her with both hands, treating it not as an object of value, but as something entrusted to him beyond any measure of money. "This never belonged to me. I was only asked to protect it until the day I could place it back into the hands of the woman it was always meant to return to." Claire accepted the necklace with trembling hands, almost afraid that touching it would cause the impossible moment to disappear. The cool silver rested against her palm with a familiar weight she had not felt in 8 long years. She traced the tiny engraving with her thumb, recognizing every delicate groove without needing to look twice. There was no doubt left. This was Daniel's necklace. She closed her fingers around it and drew one slow breath before lifting her eyes to Ethan once more. "Tell me about that night," she whispered. Ethan remained silent for a moment, not because he was searching for the right words, but because some memories deserved to be approached with care. He walked toward the windows overlooking the city and spoke without turning around. 8 years ago, I was 29 years old. I had very little influence, very little money, and more confidence than wisdom. I was traveling through the Pacific Northwest after a business meeting that ended much later than expected. Heavy rain slowed traffic to almost nothing. Claire listened without interrupting. Every detail seemed to pull her farther away from the story she had accepted for nearly a decade. "I stopped at a small roadside diner because the weather had become difficult. There were only 3 customers inside. One elderly couple, me, and your husband." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. She had never known Daniel stopped anywhere that evening. According to the official timeline, he had simply driven toward Seattle after finishing a conference. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. "He noticed I was studying several engineering sketches spread across my table. He smiled and asked whether I was trying to solve a problem or create a new one. That was how our conversation began." Despite the sadness filling the room, Claire almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Daniel. He had always started conversations with gentle humor instead of formal introductions. "We talked for nearly 2 hours, Ethan said. About business, about family, about failure. He never once mentioned his own accomplishments unless I asked directly. Instead, he wanted to hear about my ideas. He treated a complete stranger with the same respect most people reserve for lifelong friends." Claire lowered her eyes to the necklace. She could picture Daniel sitting in a quiet booth with a cup of coffee, encouraging someone he had just met simply because that was who he had always been. Ethan finally turned to face her. "Before we left, he told me something I have repeated to myself hundreds of times over the years. He said that success should never become an excuse to stop seeing people. He believed every stranger carried a story worth listening to." Claire felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. Those words belonged to Daniel as surely as the necklace did. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully removed a weathered leather card holder. From inside, he unfolded a small piece of cream-colored paper, its edges softened by time. "He insisted that I take this before we went our separate ways," Ethan said quietly. Claire recognized the handwriting before she could read a single word. Daniel's neat block letters had once filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and handwritten notes left beside the coffee maker every Monday morning. Ethan handed her the paper with both hands. At the bottom, beneath a short paragraph of encouragement, Daniel had written one final sentence. "If life ever gives you the chance to repay today's kindness, do not look for me. Find Claire. She will need hope more than I ever will." Claire read the note again, then a third time, her fingertips lingering over every familiar letter as though the ink itself carried Daniel's voice across the years. She had memorized countless emails, speeches, and journal entries he had written during their marriage. Yet this single page revealed a side of him she had never known. Even in a brief meeting with a stranger, he had been thinking about someone else's future instead of his own. She carefully folded the paper along its original creases before looking back at Ethan. "If he gave you this that night," she said quietly, "why did it take 8 years to find me?" Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, choosing honesty over convenience. "Because I made a promise to return only when I understood why he believed you would need hope more than he would. At first, I thought he was speaking about grief. Later, I realized he was speaking about truth." Claire searched his face, sensing there was still another layer hidden beneath his words. Ethan walked toward a polished walnut table and rested one hand lightly against its edge. "The morning after we met, I learned that Daniel had supposedly died before reaching Seattle. The news did not make sense. We had shared breakfast together just hours earlier. He was calm. He had changed his travel plans. He even mentioned that he intended to postpone one of his meetings because he wanted to surprise you with a weekend away after the conference." Claire felt the room grow impossibly still. Daniel had never mentioned changing his schedule. According to every official report, his route had remained exactly as planned. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I contacted the local authorities and explained that my timeline did not match the public report. They thanked me politely, took my statement, and assured me they would follow up if necessary. They never called again." Claire closed her eyes briefly. During the investigation, no detective had ever mentioned another witness. No one had suggested Daniel had spent the evening anywhere except inside his vehicle. "I assumed there was an explanation I did not understand," Ethan continued. "Years passed. My responsibilities grew. My companies expanded across Asia and North America. Yet every anniversary of that meeting, I reread Daniel's note and questioned why so many details refused to fit together." He reached into another pocket and removed a slim leather notebook worn smooth by time. Between its pages rested several neatly organized newspaper clippings, printed articles, and handwritten observations. "I stopped collecting headlines about business many years ago," he said with a faint smile. "Instead, I collected every public document connected to Daniel's case that I could legally obtain." Claire accepted the notebook with careful hands. Inside were copies of old news stories she remembered reading through tear-filled eyes, but Ethan had marked them with precise notes in the margins. Departure times differed by nearly an hour. Weather reports conflicted with witness statements. One photograph showed Daniel wearing the necklace shortly after the time investigators claimed it had already disappeared. None of the differences alone proved anything. Together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Claire slowly looked up from the pages. "You have been carrying these questions alone all this time." Ethan gave a quiet nod. "Not because I wanted to reopen someone's pain, but because Daniel believed every promise deserved to be honored. I could not return this necklace until I was certain I could also return the questions that should never have been buried beside it." Claire held the notebook against her chest as the impossible truth settled over her with quiet certainty. For 8 years, she had believed her greatest loss was saying goodbye too soon. Now she realized something even more painful. She had never been given the complete story to say goodbye to in the first place. Claire remained standing beside the window long after the lights of the gala had begun to fade across the skyline. The leather notebook rested in her hands, but her attention had drifted far beyond its pages. For years she had believed grief was something to survive. Now she understood that unanswered questions could become a different kind of prison. She slowly looked toward Ethan, who had given her all the space she needed to absorb what he had revealed. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at proving the official story incomplete. There was only quiet patience, the kind carried by someone who had lived with uncertainty for almost as long as she had. "Why did Daniel trust you?" Claire finally asked. "You met for only a few hours." Ethan smiled faintly, though sadness softened the expression before it fully appeared. "I asked myself that same question for years." He walked toward the window until they stood side by side, watching thousands of lights stretch across the city below. "During breakfast, I admitted something I had never told another businessman. I confessed that I was afraid my ambition was slowly turning me into someone who measured every relationship by usefulness. I believed success required distance." Daniel disagreed. Claire could almost hear her husband laughing gently before offering one of the thoughtful answers that always seemed simple until someone remembered them years later. Ethan continued. "He told me that the strongest people were not the ones who built the tallest buildings or signed the largest contracts. They were the ones who still recognized another person's humanity after becoming powerful enough to ignore it. Claire lowered her eyes. That sounded exactly like the man she had loved. Ethan reached into the notebook once more and carefully unfolded another page. Unlike the first note, this one contained only a few handwritten lines. He gave me permission to read this only if I ever doubted myself, Ethan said. I think tonight you deserve to hear it too. Claire nodded quietly. Ethan read the words exactly as they had been written. If you ever become successful, remember that wealth can purchase comfort but never character. Protect people before profits. Listen before judging. And if life ever places Claire in your path, help her believe that kindness still survives in this world. Ethan folded the paper with the same care Daniel had once used to write it. Those sentences shaped every major decision I made after that morning. Whenever I faced a choice between an easier path and the right one, I remembered the stranger who believed in me before I believed in myself. Claire felt tears slide silently down her cheeks. She no longer tried to stop them. They were no longer tears of helplessness, but of recognition. Even after all these years, Daniel had continued changing lives without ever knowing it. Ethan looked at her with quiet sincerity. People have called me many things over the years. Some are true, some are exaggerated. But every meaningful success I have achieved began with a conversation inside a roadside diner with a man who expected nothing in return. Claire carefully slipped the necklace around her own neck for the first time in nearly a decade. The familiar weight settled gently against her heart, not as a reminder of everything she had lost, but as evidence that Daniel's goodness had never disappeared. It had simply traveled farther than either of them could have imagined. In that silent moment, Claire realized the greatest inheritance her husband had left behind had never been his company, his investments, or his achievements. It had been the quiet transformation of another human being, and that transformation had finally found its way back home. The following morning, Claire canceled every meeting on her calendar for the first time in years. Her executive team assumed another major acquisition demanded her attention. Instead, she sat inside the quiet archives of her company's legal department with Ethan across the polished conference table, surrounded by neatly organized boxes containing every document she had preserved from Daniel's case. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating stacks of reports that had remained untouched for nearly a decade. Claire had once believed reopening those files would only reopen old wounds. Now they represented something entirely different. They represented the possibility that truth had simply been waiting for someone willing to ask the right questions. Ethan examined each page with remarkable patience. He never searched for dramatic revelations. Instead, he compared timelines, weather records, public transportation, schedules, conference attendance lists, and archived interviews with careful precision. Claire watched him work and finally understood why Daniel had trusted him. He did not chase conclusions. He respected facts. Hours passed before Ethan quietly placed two documents side by side. These cannot both be accurate, he said. Claire leaned forward. One report recorded Daniel leaving the conference shortly after 4 o'clock that afternoon. Another, issued by the event organizers months later, thanked him for participating in a private mentoring session that concluded nearly 2 hours afterward. Neither document had attracted attention because they had been filed by different organizations. Together, however, they described two completely different versions of the same day. Claire searched through additional records until she found something else. An old email from Daniel had been automatically archived by the company's server. It had never been opened because it had been scheduled for delivery the following morning after the accident had supposedly occurred. She carefully clicked the message. There was no dramatic confession waiting inside. Instead, Daniel had written only a few simple sentences to his executive assistant. He asked her to postpone a contract signing by 1 week because he had unexpectedly met someone with extraordinary potential and wanted to explore a collaborative project before making any final decisions. Claire smiled through quiet tears. Even during his last known business trip, Daniel had still been searching for ways to help another person succeed. Ethan looked thoughtfully toward the city beyond the conference room glass. He changed his plans because he believed investing in people mattered more than protecting his schedule. Claire nodded slowly. That sounds exactly like him. As the afternoon continued, a retired investigator recommended by Claire's legal counsel arrived to review the newly assembled timeline. Unlike the original inquiry years before, he approached every inconsistency with fresh eyes rather than predetermined conclusions. After several hours, he closed the final folder and spoke with measured confidence. I cannot tell you everything that happened. Some answers may never exist anymore. But I can tell you this. The official timeline should never have been considered complete. There were important facts that deserved additional examination. Claire felt an unexpected sense of peace rather than frustration. For years, she had imagined justice as discovering one final dramatic answer. Instead, she realized something quieter had already begun. Daniel's integrity was no longer confined to an incomplete report or a misunderstood memory. The people who cared about him now possessed enough truth to restore the parts of his story that had been overlooked. Ethan stood and gently closed the final archive box. Sometimes justice is not changing the past, he said softly. Sometimes it is refusing to let the past remain misunderstood. Claire looked down at the silver necklace resting against her heart and understood that, after 8 years of silence, Daniel's voice had finally been heard again, not through headlines or official documents, but through the lives he had changed without ever asking for recognition. 1 week later, Claire stood beneath the towering oak trees overlooking the quiet hillside where Daniel's memorial stone rested. The early autumn air carried a gentle breeze that stirred the golden leaves above her, filling the peaceful cemetery with the soft sound of nature preparing for another season. She had visited this place every year since his passing, always bringing fresh white lilies because they had been his favorite. Until now, every visit had ended with unanswered questions echoing louder than her prayers. This time was different. Around her neck rested the silver chain that had finally found its way home. In her hands, she carried the weathered note and the small leather notebook that had traveled across continents before returning to the person Daniel had always intended to receive them. Ethan stood several yards away, giving her the privacy he instinctively understood she needed. He did not interrupt the silence or offer comforting words. He simply remained present, honoring both the promise he had kept and the man who had inspired it. Claire knelt beside the memorial stone and gently placed the folded note against the smooth granite. She smiled through quiet tears as memories replaced sorrow one by one. She remembered Daniel laughing while teaching neighborhood children how to build model airplanes on summer weekends. She remembered the handwritten notes he slipped into her briefcase before important meetings. She remembered the way he always greeted every hotel employee, every server, every driver, and every stranger with genuine respect, never allowing success to change the kindness that defined him long before wealth ever entered their lives. For years she believed she had lost him in a single tragic night. Now she understood something extraordinary. His life had continued through every person he had encouraged, every promise he had inspired, and every act of compassion that quietly spread far beyond anything either of them could have imagined. Claire stood slowly and turned toward Ethan. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Not only for returning this necklace, but for protecting the part of Daniel that the world almost forgot." Ethan lowered his head respectfully. "I did not protect it alone. He protected it himself every time he chose kindness over convenience. I only carried it until the right person was ready to receive it." They walked together toward the cemetery entrance beneath a sky painted with warm afternoon light. Neither spoke for several minutes because no conversation could improve the peace that had finally settled between them. Before reaching the gate, Claire paused. "Daniel believed people deserved second chances," she said thoughtfully. "I think the greatest way I can honor him is to continue giving those chances to others." Ethan smiled for the first time without restraint. "Then his promise is still alive." Months later, Claire announced a new charitable foundation dedicated to mentoring young entrepreneurs who lacked opportunity but possessed determination, naming the initiative after Daniel's favorite belief that character always outlasts achievement. Ethan quietly became its first international partner, asking for no recognition beyond the chance to help others the way one stranger had once helped him inside a roadside diner. The silver chain never returned to a display case or locked drawer. Claire wore it whenever she met someone beginning a difficult journey, reminding herself that one conversation, one promise, and one act of unexpected kindness could travel farther than anyone would ever know. She had spent 8 years searching for closure, only to discover that peace had never been hidden inside a perfect explanation. It had been waiting inside the truth, carried faithfully by a promise that refused to fade with time. And on that quiet autumn afternoon, the world remembered that the greatest legacy a person can leave behind is not measured by power or wealth, but by the goodness that continues changing lives long after they are gone.